Richard Westwood pulled his Mercedes into the circular driveway of his estate, irritated with himself for forgetting his laptop. He had a crucial presentation in 2 hours, and all his notes were on that computer. At 51, he prided himself on being organized, but this morning had been chaos from the start. He left early, before 7, as he always did. His wife, Melissa, would still be sleeping in the master suite. Their 9-year-old son, Connor, would be getting ready for school. And somewhere in the house would be Patricia, their live-in nurse and housekeeper. Richard and Melissa had hired Patricia Donovan 8 months ago when Connor was diagnosed with a chronic illness that required careful monitoring and frequent medication. Patricia was in her early 40s, a skilled nurse with excellent credentials and quiet, professional demeanor. She handled everything: Connor's medical needs, the household management, even some cooking. She wore blue medical scrubs most days and kept to herself, living in the small guest suite on the first floor. Richard barely interacted with her. That was Melissa's domain. He worked long hours at his investment firm, often leaving before dawn and returning after dinner. Melissa managed the household, attended her social obligations, and oversaw Connor's care through Patricia. Or so Richard had thought. He let himself in through the front door quietly, not wanting to disturb anyone. The house was silent except for the ticking of the grandfather clock in the foyer. He headed toward his study, where he'd left the laptop on his desk. But as he passed the living room, he stopped. Froze, actually. Patricia was sitting on the couch, and Connor was lying with his head in her lap, clearly asleep. Her hand rested gently on his shoulder, and her eyes were closed. She looked exhausted, her face pale, her hair escaping from its usual neat bun. Richard stood in the doorway, confused. Why was Connor asleep on the couch at 8 in the morning on a school day? Why did Patricia look so worn out? He must have made a noise, because Patricia's eyes opened. When she saw him, she startled, sitting up straighter but careful not to wake Connor. "Mr. Westwood," she whispered, surprise evident on her face. "I didn't expect you back." "I forgot my laptop," Richard said, keeping his voice low. He gestured toward Connor. "What's going on? Why isn't he at school?" Patricia's face went through several emotions: worry, hesitation, and something that looked almost like fear. Connor had a difficult night, Mr. Westwood. His fever spiked around midnight. I've been monitoring him since then. It broke about an hour ago, and he finally fell asleep." Richard felt a cold knot form in his stomach. "Fever? What fever? Why wasn't I told?" Patricia looked down at Connor, her hand instinctively smoothing his hair. "Mrs. Westwood said not to disturb you. She said you had an important meeting today and needed your rest." "Where is my wife?" Richard asked, his voice harder than he intended. She went out, sir. She had a breakfast appointment with her friends. She said she'd be back by noon." Richard stood there, trying to process what he was hearing. Connor had been sick all night, sick enough to keep a trained nurse up monitoring him, and Melissa had gone to breakfast with friends. "Walk me through last night," Richard said quietly. "Everything." Patricia hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. But something in Richard's expression must have convinced her to tell the truth. The story that emerged made Richard's blood run cold. Connor's fever had started around dinner time. Patricia had given him medication and put him to bed, planning to check on him throughout the night. But by midnight, his temperature had climbed to 103 degrees. Patricia had gone to wake Melissa, who'd been annoyed at being disturbed. "She told me to handle it," Patricia said quietly, not meeting Richard's eyes. "She said that's what she pays me for." Patricia had spent the night in Connor's room, applying cool compresses, monitoring his temperature every 30 minutes, ready to call an ambulance if needed. By dawn, when the fever finally broke, Connor had been exhausted and disoriented. Patricia had brought him downstairs to the couch where she could keep close watch while he rested. And Melissa had left for her breakfast appointment as planned. "Has this happened before?" Richard asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. Patricia bit her lip. "Mr. Westwood, it's not my place to." "Please," Richard interrupted. "I need to know." The truth came out slowly. Melissa rarely stayed home when Connor was sick. She'd go to her lunches, her charity events, her spa appointments, leaving Patricia to handle everything. She'd get frustrated when Connor's illness interfered with her plans, sometimes speaking to him harshly when he felt too sick to eat or take his medicine. "She loves him," Patricia said quickly, as if trying to soften the blow. "I'm sure she does. She has difficulty with the medical aspects. Some people struggle with illness. It makes them uncomfortable." Richard looked at his son, sleeping peacefully now in Patricia's lap, and felt a wave of shame wash over him. How had he not seen this? How had he been so consumed with work that he'd missed what was happening in his own home? "And you?" he asked Patricia. "You've been handling all of this alone?" She nodded. "It's my job, Mr. Westwood." "No," Richard said firmly. "Your job is to be his nurse and help manage the household, not to be his only parent." Patricia's eyes widened at that, but she didn't respond. Richard's phone buzzed in his pocket. His presentation. The crucial meeting. 6 months of work riding on this one pitch. He looked at his phone, then at his son sleeping on the couch, then at the woman who'd spent the night caring for him while Richard slept soundly in his bed, oblivious. He made a decision. Richard called his office. "John, I need you to handle the presentation today." "Yes, I know it's last minute. Family emergency. Send me the outcome later." He hung up before his partner could protest further. Then he sat down in the chair across from the couch. "Tell me about his care," Richard said. "All of it. I want to understand what his days are like." Over the next hour, Patricia walked him through Connor's daily routine. The medications he took 3 times a day. The dietary restrictions he had to follow. The symptoms to watch for that could signal a crisis. The activities he couldn't participate in because they might be too strenuous. The way other kids at school sometimes excluded him because he was different. And through it all, Patricia had been there, not just administering medicine, but reading to him when he felt too sick to play, helping with homework when he'd missed school, sitting with him during scary medical tests, being the steady, caring presence that every child needs. "Why didn't anyone tell me?" Richard asked finally. "Why didn't you tell me it was this serious?" Patricia looked at him directly for the first time. "With respect, Mr. Westwood, you didn't ask. You leave early, come home late. When you're here, you're in your study working. Mrs. Westwood handles communications with you about Connor, and she tends to minimize things. I think because she doesn't want to worry you, or maybe because she doesn't want to deal with it herself." The words stung because they were true. Richard had been so focused on providing financially, on building his business, on maintaining their lifestyle, that he'd completely abdicated his role as a father. Connor stirred then, his eyes fluttering open. "Patricia?" he murmured. "I'm here, sweetheart," she said softly. Then Connor saw his father and froze. "Dad, you're home?" "I came back to check on you," Richard said, his throat tight. "I heard you weren't feeling well." Connor looked confused. "But you never come home when I'm sick." Those simple words broke something in Richard's chest. He moved to kneel beside the couch, level with his son. "I know, buddy. And I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. That's going to change, I promise." Connor studied his father's face, then said, "Patricia took care of me." "She always does." "I know she does," Richard said, glancing at Patricia, who was blinking back tears. "And I'm grateful to her. But from now on, I'm going to be here too, okay?" Over the following days, Richard began to see his life with new clarity. He started coming home at reasonable hours. He ate dinner with Connor. He asked questions about school, about how Connor was feeling, about his interests and fears and dreams. And he saw things he'd been too busy to notice before. He saw that Connor lit up when Patricia entered the room. He saw that Connor went to her first when he was scared or hurt or needed comfort. He saw that Patricia knew Connor's preferences, his moods, his needs in a way that Richard himself didn't. And he saw that Melissa was largely absent from their son's daily life. One evening, after Connor was in bed, Richard confronted his wife in their sitting room. "We need to talk about Connor," he said. Melissa looked up from her phone, irritated at the interruption. "What about him?" "About his care. About the fact that Patricia is essentially raising him while we're both checked out." "I'm not checked out," Melissa said defensively. I oversee everything. I hired Patricia. I manage his appointments. When was the last time you sat with him when he was sick? Richard asked quietly. When was the last time you read him a bedtime story or helped with his homework? Melissa's face flushed. I pay someone to do those things. That's what Patricia is for. No, Richard said firmly. Patricia is a nurse, not a replacement parent. Connor needs his mother. I never wanted this, Melissa burst out suddenly. This sick child, this constrained life. Do you know what it's like, having to plan everything around his condition? Not being able to travel or go out without worrying about his medication schedule? I married you for a life of freedom and luxury, not to be tied down by medical crises. The words hung in the air, ugly and honest. Then maybe, Richard said slowly, you shouldn't be here. The divorce was quiet and swift. Melissa moved out within a month, accepting a generous settlement in exchange for minimal custody. She'd visit Connor occasionally, but everyone involved knew she'd eventually fade from his life entirely. It was sad, but it was also honest. But the bigger change was in Richard himself. He restructured his entire life. He brought in a partner at work to handle the day-to-day operations. He started working from home several days a week. He learned Connor's medication schedule, his dietary needs, his school routine, and he talked to Patricia. Really talked to her. I want you to know, he told her one evening after Connor was asleep, that I see what you've done for my son. How you've loved him when the people who were supposed to love him most were too self-absorbed to notice he needed us. Patricia's eyes filled with tears. He's a special boy, Mr. Westwood. It's been an honor to care for him. Richard, he corrected gently. And I want to ask you something. Would you consider staying, not just as Connor's nurse, but as part of our family? I know the situation has changed with Melissa gone. I'd understand if you wanted to find another position. But selfishly, I hope you'll stay. Connor needs you, and honestly, I think I do too. Patricia smiled through her tears. I'd like nothing more than to stay. Connor has my heart. He has from the start. Over the months that followed, their little family found its rhythm. Richard learned to balance work and fatherhood. Patricia continued to care for Connor, but now Richard was the two, learning from her, partnering with her in his son's care. And slowly, he began to notice other things. The way Patricia's eyes crinkled when she laughed. The gentle patience she showed not just with Connor but with everyone. The quiet strength that had allowed her to care for a sick child night after night without complaint or recognition. One evening, nearly a year after that morning he'd come home for his laptop, Richard found Patricia in the kitchen making Connor's favorite cookies. Can I help? He asked. She smiled and handed him a mixing spoon. They worked in comfortable silence for a while, and then Richard said, Patricia, can I ask you something personal? Of course. Why did you stay all those months when you were essentially alone in caring for Connor, when neither Melissa nor I was truly present? Why didn't you leave? Patricia was quiet for a moment, measuring out flour. Because Connor needed someone to stay. And because she paused, choosing her words carefully. Because I lost a child once. Years ago, when I was younger. A car accident. She was 7. Richard's breath caught. Patricia, I had no idea. I'm so sorry. It's why I became a pediatric nurse, she continued softly. I couldn't save my daughter, but I could help other children. When I met Connor, when I saw how sick he was and how much he needed someone to really see him, to really care, I couldn't walk away. He became the child I stayed for, if that makes sense. Richard set down his spoon and turned to face her. Patricia, I don't know how to thank you for what you've done for my son. For us. You gave Connor the love and attention he desperately needed when his own parents failed him. You didn't fail him, Patricia said gently. You just needed to wake up. And you did. Because of you, Richard said. Because that morning, when I saw you on that couch with Connor, exhausted from caring for him all night while everyone else slept, it shattered something in me. All my assumptions about what mattered, about what success looked like. You showed me what real love looks like. They stood in the warm kitchen, the scent of cookies baking, and Richard felt something shift in his heart. This woman, with her quiet dedication and selfless love, had saved his son's life in ways that went far beyond medical care. She'd saved Richard's life too. Really? Saved him from becoming the kind of man who had everything except what truly mattered. "I need to tell you something else," Richard said, his heart pounding. "These past months, getting to know you, watching you with Connor, building this life together, I've developed feelings for you. Real feelings. And I understand if that's unwelcome or if it complicates things. But I needed you to know." Patricia's eyes widened, and for a long moment she didn't speak. Then she smiled, really smiled. "I was afraid to hope you felt that way. Afraid it was just wishful thinking on my part." "You mean?" "I mean that somewhere along the way, this stopped being just a job for me. You're both in my heart, Richard. You have been for a while now." They married quietly 6 months later, with Connor as Richard's best man, beaming with joy at seeing the two people he loved most become a real family. The wedding was small, just close friends and Patricia's sister, held in the garden of the house that had once felt so cold and empty but now overflowed with warmth and laughter. Years later, Richard would think back to that morning when he'd returned for his forgotten laptop and found Patricia exhausted on the couch, his sick son sleeping trustingly in her lap. That moment of seeing his life from the outside, of recognizing how far he'd strayed from what truly mattered. Sometimes we need to be shocked awake. Sometimes we need someone to show us, through their actions rather than words, what love really looks like. Not the grand gestures or expensive gifts, but the quiet sitting through long nights. The patient care. The showing up, day after day, for the people who need us. Patricia had shown him all of that. She'd saved Connor's life. She'd saved Richard's life too. And in doing so, she'd given them both something more precious than all of Richard's wealth, a real home, filled with genuine love. Connor, now healthy and thriving thanks to Patricia's devoted care and medical expertise, would sometimes ask his father about that time before Patricia became his stepmother. "Do you remember when you came home and found us on the couch?" Connor asked one evening. "I remember," Richard said. "Patricia had been up with me all night," Connor said. "She sang to me when I was scared. She made me feel safe." "I know, buddy." "Dad?" Connor looked up at him with those serious eyes. "I'm glad you came home that day. I'm glad you saw." "Me too, son," Richard said, pulling him into a hug. "Me too." Because sometimes the most important moments in our lives are the ones we almost miss, the ones we stumble into by accident, returning for a forgotten laptop on an ordinary morning. The moments that show us the truth we've been too blind to see, that love isn't something you schedule or delegate or pay someone else to handle. It's the late nights and the patient care and the showing up when things are hard. Richard had almost missed it all. But he'd been given a second chance. And he was determined never to take it for granted again.